Welcome to my podcast, The Lower Downland Experience. Many of you will know me from my Instagram page, @FabulousPharmacist, where I love to shine a light on topics that people normally shy away from. Today I spoke with Kingston Mills, Professor of Experimental Immunology at Trinity College Dublin. We spoke about his early athletics and science careers, immunology, COVID, the development of vaccines for cancer, Alzheimer's and other diseases, exercise, and whether or not online learning will make lecture theatres a thing of the past. To support the Lower Downland Experience, please check out my sponsors in the podcast notes below. Enjoy the show. Professor Mills, or Kingston.
Kingston's fine.
It's such an honour to have you on the show. Delighted to have you here. You are a renowned professor of immunology. You've won many awards. So most notably, the most recent one was the Trinity Provost's Award for Innovation, isn't that right?
That's right. And the Science Foundation Ireland Researcher of the Year Award in 2020 as well. Both of those awards.
Yes. Fantastic. And you were the voice of reason throughout COVID, which is why I reached out to you to get you on. It's where actually you first popped up. Obviously, I knew about your athleticism, which we'll get into now as well. But you hail from Mullingar.
That's right.
And there's a few national figures that have actually come from Mullingar, most notably the late, great Joe Dolan, of course. We've Niall Horan and we've Michael O'Leary.
Yes.
And we also have the heifers down there, don't we, as well?
We do indeed.
The beef to the heels heifers. So can you tell me a little bit about your growing up in Mullingar and where you got your love of science and then obviously athleticism from?
So I was brought up on a farm. My father was a farmer. My brother has taken over the farm and his son are dairy farmers down in County Westmeath. So I went to the local school, Wilson's Hospital in Multifarnham. And it wasn't a brilliant academic school at the time, but it had a fantastic science teacher who really inspired me in biology in particular. And that was the sort of beginning of my love of science, coming from inspirational teacher Tommy Johnston, who set me on the road to a wonderful world of biology.
It's always the teachers that do it for you, isn't it? I remember a teacher of mine in 6th class, actually, and she was the one that really opened my mind. Mrs. Stafford, I'll never forget her. She used to make us write essays about random topics. One of them was called If, and as a 6th class, 12 years old, this was just mind-boggling to me. But you always remember the really good teachers, don't you, that kind of set you in your ways.
That's right. And it was the same in 3rd level. I had some inspirational lecturers that taught me when I was doing my degree in biochemistry.
Yeah.
Bruno Orsu passed away a couple of years ago. John Scott and Clayton Love. These were people in the biomedical area. That's where I headed from biochemistry into immunology at the end of my undergraduate into my postgraduate, which was in immunology. So that was the beginning of my love of immunology.
Yeah.
So again, inspired by some inspirational lectures in biomedical area.
Yeah, it is amazing what these people will do. But you actually won an award in secondary school, didn't you? If I'm right, Student of the Year.
I was.
I've done my research
in Wilson's Hospital. In fact, interestingly, I was back in the school during the second time since I left the school a couple of months ago to do the annual prize giving.
Okay.
It's unbelievable to see the transformation over the years of the school now, how it's a vibrant sort of modern school. In my day, it wasn't so vibrant. It was a boys-only boarding school when I went there, and then it amalgamated with a girls' school, Preston College, and it became a co-educational school, and it transformed the school. It made it into a sort of an enjoyable place to be rather than a boys-only school.
Yeah, I do wonder about our education system here, where we have a lot of boys only and girls only schools. My 3 sons go to a boys only school, and I'd much rather if it was co-ed, but it's the local school down the road. It makes sense in that sense, but I would like them, because an all boy household, can you imagine the fighting and the screaming and the
definitely co-educational schools are I think a much better bet for everybody, because I think it's more natural that boys and girls should be taught together rather than separated.
Yeah, I agree. And did your love of athleticism come from Mullingar as well? I know your father Frank was
He was indeed
a runner himself.
He was an Irish international. He ran cross country for Ireland on a number of occasions. And then I started running when I was in school. But the rugby was really the big sport in the school, so I didn't really have much of an opportunity as a teenager to run. It was really when I went to college I started running properly, and I was too small for rugby, so I took up running really in my first year in college, and then worked my way up and became eventually an Irish international. Ran for 8 consecutive years for Ireland, cross country, track and field, and on the marathon in the end. So
Yeah.
I had a good career. It was a toss up really between being dedicated sports person versus being a scientist. And I when I finished in school, I had an option of doing physical education in Limerick or doing science in Trinity.
Okay.
And I had to toss up which one I was going to go for. And we didn't have careers guidance teacher. That's unbelievable. But we didn't have a careers guidance teacher at the school. So I had to figure this out for myself. My parents, none of my family had ever been to university.
Okay.
So it was a decision I had to make myself, which I did. And I chose science because I reckoned that, physical education would be great when you're in your 20s, 30s, and maybe even 40s. But when you get older and you get injured,
Creaky.
you're not going to want to go out on a rugby pitch or the running track, and even for coaching. So, I think science probably was more. There was a bigger draw for me to go towards science than a physical education career, because I thought there was more to it,
Yeah.
and it was more intellectually challenging, and that's really the attraction for it for me.
Yeah.
To go into science.
You narrowly missed out on the Olympics, though, didn't you, for Ireland? Was it 1984?
Yeah, the Los Angeles Olympics, I had the qualifying time for the marathon, and I was one of 3 Irish athletes at the qualifying time. So in theory, all 3 of us could have gone. But John Tracy, who had the 10,000 meter time, decided to run the marathon. And of course, he ended up getting the silver medal. So I won't hold it against him that he kept me out of the team, but he did keep me out of the team, and I would have gone had John decided not to run the marathon. But Ireland did win a silver medal.
Yeah, I actually grew up up the road from John Tracy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? His wife is a lovely lady. But and then, so what's your standout moments in terms of your athletic career?
Yeah, I suppose winning the National Irish Marathon is probably the biggest achievement. Even though it was a smallish field, winning a national title is always a sort of a big thing. And it's sort of, I followed my father's footsteps. He had won national titles across country, and then going on to represent Ireland in the World Championships in the marathon in Rome, the World Track and Field Championships, and then twice at the World Cross Country Championship. So those are the standout successes, really.
A great old time there, 2:13:55.
That's right, yeah, 2:30. I mean, and those were in the days when the shoes weren't assisting you like they do now. Yeah. So I reckon if I'd had those, modern day shoes, I might have knocked a few minutes off that.
And do you still run now?
No, I don't. I got badly injured when I was in my mid-30s, and ended up having to stop very quickly.
Okay.
I took up mountain biking as a competitive sport when I stopped running.
Okay.
So I was a competitive mountain biker for 3 or 4 years until I had a serious accident on the bike. I was hit by a car out on the road and ended up in hospital with severe injuries. So that put paid to my cycling competitive career, although I do still cycle recreationally just for fun up the Dublin Wicklow Mountains at the weekends.
Okay, so you don't run at all now anymore?
Not running anymore.
Okay, and did you used to run around the Trinity track the way? Do you remember this? We'd be sitting in the pav and we'd see the people running around Trinity track.
I was one of those people that pounded the track in Trinity for years when I was there as a student. Absolutely.
Okay, and so then we're bringing you onto your career in science. So obviously you went into immunology and obviously loved it. So what kind of drew you to that area of science?
Well, I did an undergraduate degree in biochemistry, and one of my inspirational lecturers that I'd mentioned earlier, John Scott, at the end of my undergraduate, I had an opportunity of doing a PhD in either biochemistry or one in immunology. And again, I was undecided. And at this time, I did seek advice. And John said to me, biochemistry, you'll get your degree. It won't be that exciting. But if you go to immunology, it's a newish discipline, and it's biomedical related, and it's an awful lot of exciting discoveries to be made. So that's what I suggest you do. So I did. Yeah. And I never looked back. And immunology is a fantastic discipline, because almost every disease you can think of either has an immunological basis to it, or there's potential for immunology to come up with a new treatment. Yeah. Even things like cardiovascular diseases, cancer, things we don't normally consider to have anything to do with immunology, are now immunology-based drugs are being used to treat these diseases, which is phenomenal. Things like Alzheimer's disease, antibodies against the amyloid beta peptide are beginning to show some promise. So,
I know.
It's amazing. And Parkinson's, I read a paper this morning which showed that a therapy that's used to treat psoriasis has been tested now in Parkinson's disease because of the immunological basis of neurological diseases as well. So immunology has a lot to offer in terms of understanding disease mechanisms, but also treatments.
And you touched on Alzheimer's there. So there's been a relatively new study come out or a paper came out about that new drug that you're talking about that's showing great promise? Because the problem with the drugs that we have currently for Alzheimer's is that they don't slow the progression of the disease at all.
No, there's no real treatment. I mean, there are interventions that can slow progression, non-drug interventions. And probably the best one is exercise. So exercise has a huge benefit in slowing potential progression or the onset of dementia or Alzheimer's. Both exercise for the body as well as for the brain is very good at stopping progression of dementia. In terms of drugs, the antibody that I just talked about has some ability to slow it down, but really it's a long way off being a treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And treatment is really going to be the tricky one. So stopping the disease once it's started.
Yeah. And when you say exercise for the brain and Alzheimer's, you hear anecdotally, oh, someone gave up work and retired, and then, they didn't use their brain enough, and then they got a bit dithery and dothery, and then, they got sick with dementia or Alzheimer's. Is there something to that in terms of keeping yourself active and well, active physically, that's an aside, but keeping your brain mentally going?
Yeah, I mean, I'm married to a neuroscientist, so I do have a little bit of secondhand knowledge on this. I don't profess to be an expert on Alzheimer's, but she is a great believer in exercising the brain and doing things like crosswords, playing the piano, taking up a language later in life, exercising the brain in a way that normally you wouldn't exercise. So getting it to do something new.
Mm-hmm.
Like writing with your left hand if you're right-handed, taking a shower.
Oh my goodness!
Taking a shower in the dark.
Okay.
Standing on one leg for as long as you can, because it's creating balance, it's getting the brain to exercise itself. So all sorts of things that get you outside of your comfort zone are good for exercising the brain.
Okay, I never thought of that. Having a shower in the dark, that'll be the next thing. Then I think standing on the leg could be a little bit a push too far sometimes for some people. Anyway, and then in terms of all the immunological advances that we're seeing now, like when I came out of college, we were just kind of talking about gene therapy and all this immunotherapy, but now like there's a hell of a lot of high-tech drugs, I suppose, on the market now, but the biologicals, all of those. So have you played a part in the development of many of them, or what's your special area of interest?
My special area of interest within immunology is mainly autoimmune diseases, although we're also working in infectious disease. So vaccines is one of my specialist areas, and the other one is in treatments for autoimmune diseases. And, as well as running a lab in Trinity, which does what we call fundamental discovery research. It doesn't, at that level, you don't create new drugs. What you're doing is you're trying to identify mechanisms of disease, which might identify targets for new drugs. But I have been involved in founding 3 startup companies, all of which have been based around immunology and development of drugs. One of those is still active. Two of them sort of went by the wayside, mainly because the drugs that we developed didn't get into the right stage of clinical development. There's a lot of failure as well as success in the biotech industry. So every 100 drugs that are the potential for treatment diseases, maybe one of them might work, and that's typical of drug development. Success is rarer than you would think. And
even when you get it to the stage of that 1 in 100, actually getting it to trial and getting it to market is again,
it is. And mostly that is done by large pharma, not by small biotech startup companies. So most startup biotech companies that have a drug that's looking reasonably successful will get acquired by a large pharma, because the cost of putting through a second phase 2 trials is prohibitive for a small company. It's really only large pharma that can do that. So that's the normal mechanism of development of biotechs. They might get the drug through a phase 1 trial, but it would be rare to go through phase 2 or 3.
Okay. And obviously vaccines being your speciality, you were the man on the scene for COVID, and we all listened to you and heard you, and you really were the voice of reason and give very sound advice. And and even when we decided to lift things, you were suggesting that we did it maybe a little bit too soon, etc. So can we go back to maybe that period in terms of the whole vaccine development and the new technology that came from, and maybe I think we all know what vaccines do now. I think, anyone on the face of the planet that doesn't know, they haven't been listening to the radio, but maybe just explain a little bit about what they do and these new vaccines that are coming on the market now too.
So infectious diseases are For example, COVID-19 is an infectious disease caused by SARS-CoV-2. So what a vaccine does, it tries to stop the infection. As a second bet, it can stop the disease. Now, it turned out, if you take a vaccine like measles, mumps, rubella, the 3-in-1 MMR, these are very effective vaccines at stopping infection. So they stop people getting the infection as well as the disease. Then there are other vaccines like the whooping cough vaccine, not as effective at stopping infection, but stops disease. So children, young infants that get the vaccine will rarely get whooping cough. And COVID, initially we thought the vaccines would prevent infection, but in fact they didn't, mainly because of the virus variants. The virus evaded the immune response generated with the vaccine. So they actually prevent disease, COVID-19. And that has been the huge benefit by saving lives, people dying from COVID-19 and getting into hospital. But the second generation vaccines, which are going to come along, will be designed to prevent the infection with the virus that causes COVID-19. So the vaccines for COVID was a revolution. First, for two reasons. One, it was developed so quickly, within a year to 18 months, in terms of the pandemic starting and a vaccine being on the market. But there were at least 15 years of research that had been going on the platform, this messenger RNA or mRNA vaccine platform that was used in the successful Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. So it wasn't a matter of just a year's work. It was a year of development of that particular vaccine, but 15 years at least of preliminary work that led to that day that they started working on it.
And can you see why people were probably worried and concerned when, there's this awful disease out there and then suddenly, oh God, we've got a brand new vaccine, guys, let's just inject everyone. Can you see why the public, I suppose, I think for Ireland as a country, there was a great public buy-in. And there were people that were very hesitant towards it, but can you see how maybe the messages were mixed and didn't get explained properly to people?
I think that it's understandable that the public were nervous about having a vaccine which hadn't been typical type of vaccine. The vaccines we have before COVID were killed bacteria, killed viruses, live attenuated bacteria, live attenuated viruses, and what we call protein vaccines, things like the pertussis or the tetanus vaccine. And they were very safe. But the new vaccine was messenger RNA. So this is the genetic material that codes for the proteins that make up the components of the virus. It was a new approach, which had been, as I said, in development, but this was the first success with it. But it was, it's estimated that the mRNA vaccines alone have saved 18 million lives that would have died from COVID-19. So the success of them is absolutely phenomenal. Now, they're not preventing infection. So there will be better vaccines that will come along. And one of the things we're doing in my lab is looking at how giving vaccines into the nose for respiratory infections is better than injecting them, because you're generating the immune response at the site of the infection. So you're stopping the virus in its tracks before it gets hold. The trouble with an injectable vaccine, you don't get this local immunity in the nose. You get it around the body, but it's not as strong in the nose as it would be if you gave the vaccine into the nose. So that's, I think, the future of respiratory vaccines for respiratory diseases will be vaccines that are given locally.
So currently the children's flu vaccine is given through the nose.
That's right. The flu vaccine for the children is highly effective, very easy to administer. And it really is an example of where I think the vaccine field is going to be going.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful because you get the kids in and out. If you were to be injecting kids, it wouldn't happen, on that scale that you can do it so quickly.
But it's also more effective than the injected one, which is even, a double benefit. It's easier to administer and it's more effective.
So do you know why we don't vaccinate adults for flu through the nose?
It is an anomaly. I mean, and there are countries that do use the flu vaccine, the flu mist or whatever its name is in Europe, the nasal vaccine for adults, and it does work in adults. I think it's sort of like sometimes it's hard to stop tradition, and if companies and health authorities have gone down a line of making a vaccine that's injectable and it's working, they don't want to change. So it's bringing about that sort of change is a tricky one, but the vaccine will work in adults given nasally. So absolutely.
Yeah, no, it is. And the nasal vaccine that you're looking to develop for COVID, how is that going? Any insights?
Yeah, I mean,
I want some new info.
we have nice data that it can prevent infection in the nose, whereas an injected vaccine doesn't prevent infection; it prevents disease. So this vaccine that we have at very early stages prevents both infection and disease, and it prevents infection importantly in the upper and lower respiratory tract where the virus, first catches hold. And
how does it prevent infection? How does it prevent it?
How does it prevent it? So what the vaccine does is it makes stimulates the immune system. The immune system makes two types of response. One is called the T cells, which are cells of the immune system are activated, which can kill virus-infected cells. And the second thing is it helps to make antibodies. And the antibodies are like a lock and key. So they latch on to the virus and stop it binding to its receptor. So if you stop the virus getting to its receptor, the virus needs to get inside human cells to replicate. If it can't get inside a human cell, it can't replicate, therefore you don't get an infection. And what the antibodies do is they lock on to the virus surface protein, stop it from getting to its receptor, therefore stop it from infecting the cell. So it's what's called sterilizing immunity.
Mm-hmm.
It stops it in its tracks completely. And this is sort of the holy grail of vaccination, of getting sterilized immunity. So you get no infection at all. So there's, clearly if you get no infection, you're going to get no disease. Whereas the current vaccines don't stop it from infecting, they stop the severe effects of the infection and causing disease.
And they did think initially that the COVID vaccines prevented transmission as well or slowed it down, but that wasn't the case. Am I right?
What happened was it was a combination of factors. The virus changed, after the vaccine was introduced, so it varied. And the sequence was very different from the original Wuhan strain. And so the vaccine might have had some impact, in fact, did have some impact on infection and therefore transmission against the original strain, but not against mutated strains, because it finding it harder and harder to recognize mutated strain, because mutated strain was so different from the original strain. So it was a combination of factors, the fact that the vaccine wasn't inducing the antibodies at the site of infection, and that the virus had moved on from the original strain that had caused disease in China at the beginning. So, it's not all, we're not all blaming it on the vaccine. It's the virus being extremely clever and figuring out how to evade the response by mutating. And that's why we've had, endless variants emerging. These variants each one is more successful than the previous one. And that's what has made it so tricky to eliminate the virus. And what we're doing right now is containing it.
Okay. And can I just ask you just to explain, how does a virus, how does it mutate? And then how does it, because we were talking about, let COVID burn out. So with the first one, which was deadly. And then, it went on to, through various mutations until we got to Omicron, and no one was really too worried about Omicron. It was almost like, oh, sure, great. It's great if I get it. So in terms of, a virus burning out, how does that actually happen?
Okay, so when a virus is dividing, it only does it inside a mammalian human cell. So it gets into the cells in the lining of your nose around the lung. And once it's inside the cell, it hijacks the replicative machinery of the cell for it to replicate. And each time it replicates, it has to make a copy of its genetic material. And when it's making that copy, mistakes can occur, very sporadically. So one codon can change. And what you do is if that virus that emerges then that has come from that mutation, if it is more effective at binding to the cell receptor, then it gets selected for. So it's natural selection. So what happens is that a virus that can infect more readily and that can transmit more readily is going to have a selective advantage over a virus that is less able to bind and less able to transmit. So you get selective pressure being exerted on the viruses, so to the benefit of the virus. Mm-hmm. So what emerges then are variants that are more infectable and therefore more transmissible. And that's what's happened with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. As each time mutations emerge, the ones that have the mutations that make the virus more infective get selected for, and it pushes out the other ones then. So that's why Omicron came, it pushed out Delta, and then we had BA1 pushing out original Omicron, and then we have BA4 and BA5, and now there's a plethora of other ones. And
I have lost track of the amount.
Yeah, so China is probably the biggest worry we have right now. I mean, COVID is pretty well, it's sort of petered out quite a lot in most of Europe and North America. But China, because they had a zero COVID policy, kept it out for almost 2 years, and now have a big epidemic, and they've relaxed a lot of their restriction measures. So I predict there's going to be, and because a lot of people in China didn't get vaccinated, and particularly the older population in China. So
Why is that? Do you
it is.
know?
I don't understand what they had a policy of zero COVID. So effectively, they were saying that the way they're going to contain COVID is not through vaccination, but through restrictions. That backfired big time now, because the restrictions just couldn't be contained. The public would no longer buy into them. And because of ours were so transmissible, it was impossible. So they were then falling back on the vaccine. But the trouble was that first of all, they'd made their own vaccines. They weren't as effective as the mRNA vaccines. They were inactivated vaccines. That was the first problem. And secondly, they hadn't rolled them out to the extent that Europe and North America had. So they were way behind most of the rest of the world, in fact, in vaccination. As to why the older population didn't get vaccines, I don't know, but I assume it's something to do with the fact that the older generation, I assume, are more conservative. Maybe they got worried about vaccines. I don't know the reason.
Yeah, and what are your thoughts on the way the Chinese government did do it, like with the lockdowns and with tracking people? People were tracked.
Yeah, I mean, it seems extraordinary. It would never happen in a European country. I mean, I wrote an article for The Conversation, I suppose 6 months into the pandemic, about the zero COVID policy that New Zealand, Australia, and China were following at the time. And the point I made in that article was, it's not going to work. It just can't work, because inevitably you can't keep a country closed for indefinitely. So, and New Zealand found that out, even though they looked like they were doing a fantastic job initially, and they kept it out, but inevitably it came into New Zealand, and they had a big spike in cases after it had subsided in Europe. So I think the zero COVID policy was a bit misdirected, because it was technically impossible, and and countries' economies and people's rights were completely infringed. And China, of course, could get away with that, but a country like New Zealand, there's no way they could.
Yeah.
So I think people bought into it initially in New Zealand, because they reckoned, and they had a very good leader who showed a lot of strong leadership, and she got the people to buy into it. But I think eventually that too, it was unsustainable to keep that policy up.
Yeah, no, it was. And then just on that whole thing about China and the lockdown and it all being lifted now, and there is they're seeing queues of people now coming down with it, and they just don't have the hospital infrastructure there, or the healthcare infrastructure to look after people if they do get seriously ill. So that is a concern. But another concern that we have with China and countries that we're dependent upon ourselves in this country and in Europe wide is, so we're dependent on them to make the raw materials for the antibiotics that we use. So they, the vast majority of our drugs are actually, they're made in those countries, or some of the raw materials, some of the excipients, by virtue of the fact that there's cheap labor there, and they can make them en masse, etc., and ship them over, or however they get them over here. And we now currently, so it's December 2022, and we currently have an antibiotic shortage in children's medications at the minute. And, medications going in and out of supply at the minute. In general, it's a serious issue in pharmacy. What are your thoughts on all of this, and your thoughts on antibiotic resistance, and what that means for us looking to the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've abused the use of antibiotics over the years, over prescription of antibiotics to adults, or to humans, but also in the food industry, in pigs and poultry, unconstrained use as a growth promoter, it was called. It's used prophylactically, or was, until the EU banned it in animal feed. So that had led to a lot of antibiotic resistance. That those strains then went from animal species into human. And MRSA is people will be very familiar with it. This is a resistant strain of Staphylococcus aureus, and it's a big scourge in many of the hospitals. We haven't heard a lot about it in recent winters, perhaps because of COVID,
Yeah.
and because other events sort of don't give it headline news. But it's still a problem. Antibiotic resistance, short of antibiotics, is a big issue now with many drugs. Brexit had an impact on drug delivery, but China, as you said, is a mass producer, especially of chemical drugs, because it can be made cheaply there. So that is a worry for the future.
Yeah, it is. And but I just wonder going forward what we're going to do about the whole antibiotic resistance, because it is getting worse. And I suppose we were, even ourselves, I would have seen it in pharmacy over the years. And GPs, through no fault of their own, would have felt obliged almost. Someone goes for a consultation and pays them, and if they come out just saying, "Oh, well, look, you just need to go and get rest," it's almost like the patient was annoyed if they didn't get an antibiotic. So there was that. I think we need to change the mindset. Do you know how we could possibly do that
Well,
without?
I think it's very important that if a patient has something like strep A, that they do get the antibiotics when
Yeah.
they need them, because antibiotics can. There are streptococcus doesn't have the same problem. Staphylococcus has what causes the MRSA. But streptococcus does not resistant strains, and penicillin works very effectively with streptococcus. So if someone has a strep throat and they're young, prescribing antibiotics can stop scarlet fever and worse,
Yeah.
meningitis and potentially death. And so antibiotics save lots of lives. So let's not be afraid to prescribe it when we need to prescribe it. But I agree
Absolutely.
with you. There's a lot of overprescription, and a lot of that pressure comes from the patient who expect, with a viral infection, which antibiotics have no benefit for, to prescribe. And the GP is familiar enough with looking at patients to know whether someone has a strep throat and needs antibiotics, or has a viral infection and doesn't need it. And I think they need to be trusted,
Yes.
the GPs, because they do a fantastic job.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I think that the concern in the public domain is if they can't get access to the antibiotics. Now, there are ways and means around it. People can use alternative antibiotics to penicillin, or they can use the adult capsules and open them up and that. But we're seeing a real knock-on effect of, say, the fact that we are so dependent on one country, or an amount of countries in far away from us for these raw materials. It's
Yeah.
it's a concern, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and Brexit was similar, because the UK was a big source of drugs for the Irish market. But I think, we've already found ways around that. And I think we probably would find ways around the supply issue from China as well. So I wouldn't be too pessimistic about that. I think
Okay.
when there's a demand for a drug, there's always going to be some alternative supplier that will come up with a way of making it in another country. So I'd be less worried about that than I would about some of the other issues that we're facing with. And coming back to what's the solution to the antibiotic resistance, the solution is a vaccine. Because with something like Staph aureus, there is no vaccine that works. But there's a lot of research going on. There's a colleague of mine in Trinity, Rich McLaughlin, working on this right now with pharma companies, and they're getting closer to being able to say what is needed for a vaccine, at least. And I think with all the benefit of the vaccines against COVID and the good press that has given to the vaccine field, how we can save so many lives, it has made people think about the huge benefit of vaccination. And the governments need to put more money into the research that developmental research that I mentioned earlier about the mRNA vaccines. That's the sort of thing that we need to be investing in for the future. So vaccines against MRSA, against other diseases where there are no vaccines, is what we need. Things like HIV, hepatitis C. HIV hasn't gone away. It's not in the news like we've had monkeypox. Luckily, we have a vaccine against monkeypox that happened to be there. But these new infections will come along, and we need to be able to respond to them quickly. And the best way of dealing with infections is to have a vaccine.
Yes. And why isn't there a vaccine against HIV? It's a disease that we've known about for years and years and years. It kills an awful lot of people in sub-Saharan Africa, and
It's been a very tough nut to crack. I worked superficially on this for a while when I was living in the UK, and the problem is that getting a little bit technical, the protein equivalent on the HIV virus that the SARS virus has are very. They've got a lot of similarities. In fact, they're both enveloped proteins. But the HIV one has been very difficult to make in a protein form to put it into a vaccine, so they get the structures right. But I strongly believe when they apply the mRNA technology, which they are doing now, to the HIV vaccine development, we may have success.
Okay.
So I think, coming out of the legacy of COVID-19, you will see vaccines against many other diseases, not just viral, but also cancer. For example, there's a huge amount of work being done right now on new developments for cancer based around the mRNA technology that was used for COVID vaccines. Not just vaccines, but also getting therapeutic drugs into the body using mRNA as an approach. First of all, it's an awful lot easier to make and cheaper to make than the protein equivalents, and it's quite effective in preclinical work. So I would predict that this is going to be a revolution in new therapies based around messenger RNA, not just vaccines, but proteins that will come from that messenger RNA.
So do you think there's going to be almost a vaccine for everything then?
Well, that would be the hope, that any infectious disease that kills somebody, or can kill somebody, then we have in theory the capabilities of making a vaccine. There are some like HIV, which has been really difficult. Staph aureus, another one, very difficult. Hepatitis C has been difficult as well, and there are reasons for that. But if we keep pounding away at it and apply the new technology, I'd be optimistic that we will see, if we had this conversation in 10 years' time, that there'll be a plethora of new vaccines against a range of diseases that we thought wasn't possible.
And when you mention cancer, it would be vaccines against an infectious illness that caused the cancer, or a vaccine against the cancer itself?
I mean, in the case of human papillomavirus, that's an infection that causes the cancer, and we've got a very effective vaccine against HPV that stops the cancer. But there are lots of cancers where there's no known viral or infectious agents that are involved. So here the vaccine is against the mutated protein on the cancer cell. So it's the target of the immune response. So what you do is you immunize with that cancer protein, the tumor antigen, it's called, and that becomes the vaccine with an adjuvant. Or you can apply for a messenger RNA type. And there already was one vaccine license for prostate cancer. Now, it didn't actually take off because the efficacy wasn't that great, and it was a cell-based therapy, which was complicated. It was a personalized medicine. But what it did do is it showed it's possible, and there are literally hundreds of other potential cancer vaccines now in development in the early stages and middle stages. They're into phase 2 trials, some into phase 3.
And will these vaccines be something that someone would take before they get cancer, or could it be something that they take if they get diagnosed and it could help,
and
the immune system?
The number of potential applications, and it's unlikely at this stage that we'll see everybody in the community being vaccinated before they get cancer, because that would be, there's so many potential cancers that would be very difficult to do. So the cancer vaccines are really what we call therapeutic vaccines. They're given after you've been diagnosed. So, for example, with something like prostate or breast cancer, the patient would have surgery to remove the tumor, and then it would be vaccinated to stop a recurrence. So what you're doing is you're cranking up the immune response against the tumor. So if any residual tumor cells remain, or if new ones come back for whatever reason, the immune system is able to zap them quickly enough, and they won't develop into a tumor. And that's the sort of major goal of the tumor vaccine.
Okay. And you touched on monkeypox there. So that was, I think, when monkeypox came, everyone was just like, oh, for God's sake, we've just, we've just come out of COVID. We now have monkeypox. So what are your thoughts on that? It's really, it's a subset really of people that are transmitting it as well at the minute, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the transmission of monkeypox is nothing like that of COVID. COVID is a respiratory, caused by a respiratory virus, SARS-CoV-2, which is extremely easy to transmit. So it's almost impossible to stop the transmission of it if you're in contact with an infected person now, because they're so transmissible. With monkeypox, it's really skin-to-skin contact that's required for transmission of the virus. So it's more difficult, and it's usually sexual transmission. The majority of cases have been, and so that's why it hasn't spread anything like at the rate that COVID-19 has. So, and there is a vaccine, and this is the good thing.
The vaccine was already there, though, wasn't it?
It was already there, and just had to resurrect a production of it. And in fact, there were some stocks that some countries had. So that was great, and they were able to do it. Now, I don't know at what extent they've rolled it out for high risk people, but that meant potentially, if there was a serious epidemic, that you could in theory crank that up even further, and at least immunize the people at risk.
Yeah. So just getting back to the time during COVID as well, what do you think like looking back on the way Ireland responded to it, and what do you think we could have done differently for, say, like the next big threat that comes to us? How would we, if you were in charge, or
follow the science is the key thing.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think to be fair to the Irish authorities, they did a good job at following the science. We did have to sort of shout fairly loud on the media, some of us, in terms of making sure that they did listen. But, I remember being on one of the TV programs quite early. This was around March of just before St. Patrick's Day of the first year of the epidemic. And there were talks about whether we were going to cancel the parades on St. Patrick's Day or not. And I was on the program saying, we absolutely have to cancel these parades.
Yeah.
And the politicians were there with me saying, no, we couldn't possibly, it's not necessary. And within days, they changed their minds and they had cancelled it, which was the correct thing to do. It was the same at the Italian rugby match. It was already raging in northern Italy. And we saw incredible images of coffins being loaded onto military trucks in northern Italy, and it was shocking. It really shocked me to see this, and it made me go out there and say, look, we've got to implement measures. So there was a little bit of resistance to that at the beginning, because people didn't think this can't possibly be happening in Ireland, and then they realized, yes, it can happen in Ireland when the first cases were diagnosed here. To be fair to the government here, they did, and the health authorities, were very reactive then once they recognized the seriousness of the threat. And we were one of the best countries in the world for our vaccine uptake. So the Irish public really bought into the measures that the government and the health authorities put in place. So I actually think we did a very good job in Ireland at containing it and minimizing the number of cases, and particularly the number of hospitalization and deaths from COVID-19 was relatively low in Ireland compared with other countries because of the buy-in to the restrictions.
Yeah. No, you're right. I agree with you. Now, the one thing that I find a little bit dismaying was, I remember at one stage, just towards the end, but just before all the restrictions seemed to lift, like literally overnight, I was in the pharmacy and we were being told, the masks that you're using are not actually sufficient. You need to get the big,
FFP2,
those mad ones that cost a fortune. 1 week, and then literally a week later, it was like, masks off, everything's gone, COVID's gone. What are your thoughts on the way that played out? Because it was almost like, I felt, hit by a truck almost, because...
Yeah, it was a bit of a shock. I mean, again, I was on a TV program. It was the Katie Hannon show on the Saturday morning, and the day that they made this decision, and I was on again with politicians. I was the only non-politician on the program, and they were all clapping each other on the back, saying, it's all over. We can get back to normal life now. That's it. We'll hear no more about COVID-19.
Yeah.
And I was there saying, hang on a minute, it's not so quick. We have Omicron right now, but that was 2 or 3 days after the BA1 virus had just been discovered, I think, in the UK. And I said, there's another variant on its way. And if we have any further, resistance to the vaccine, we're not out of the woods just yet. So I think we should, a little bit more constraint on the mask wearing for a while. Well, I mean, I was popular during the COVID thing in terms of what I said in the media, but that morning changed everything.
Okay.
Because
did we get death
suddenly
threats?
I got a barrage of abuse from people on social media saying that I was infringing on people's rights by forcing them to wear masks. I wasn't forcing anyone to wear masks. I was pointing out that, just ease off things for a few weeks until let's see how we go. But as it turned out, the politicians were probably right. Everyone got back to turn to relatively normal within a few months. There might have been a few people. I mean, if you were a family of someone who got COVID during that period and ended up in hospital, or were still died from COVID, then you might have a different view on it, So yeah, you have to bear that in mind. You have to weigh up the benefit of the country as a whole versus the risks the smaller number that do get a disease can kill you. So that's the message that you need to take on board when you're making those decisions.
Yeah. Do you see, or is there another threat looming, do you think?
There's always
that
going
we
to be a
should be
threat
worried
looming.
about?
And there's nothing that we know of right now that is going to be anything like COVID-19. But, zoonotic transmission, this is coming from animals into humans, is always an issue. And you never can predict what virus is going to jump from species. A lot of us come out of Southeast Asia because partly of the practices there of killing of animals, living close to animals. So there's more interaction between humans and animals there than there might be in Europe because of the way people live and the way they butcher their animals as well. It makes transmission.
How do they do it?
Well, with a lot of blood. And
Okay.
when you get blood, it's a route for transmission. So there is inevitably going to be more viruses that are going to leave animal species where they mightn't be that much of a problem, and that's often the case. When a virus jumps from species, it can become more pathogenic. Sometimes it's less pathogenic. For example, a good example is the cowpox that was the basis of the vaccine against smallpox. It caused a serious disease in cows, but when it went into humans, it caused a mild disease, but prevented serious disease caused by smallpox.
Yeah.
So it was a wonderful, discovery over 2 centuries ago by Edward Jenner on how the vaccine was developed. So jumping species can be resulting in it being milder, but the big problem is when it results in a virus that's more dangerous, more pathogenic, and that's what happened with SARS-CoV-2 and with other pathogens like MERS and Ebola and other ones that are lurking, waiting to transmit into humans. We don't know; it's impossible to predict, but we must be ready for them, and I think that's the sort of important take-home message. We must have plans to deal with infectious diseases, pandemics when they arise, and we must have the infrastructure to prepare vaccines to curtail their spread.
So working in Trinity, obviously, like Trinity, it's at the cutting edge really of science and immunology. Is there anything really exciting coming down the tracks that you're doing, that you're looking at?
Yeah, there's lots of very good labs there. Luke O'Neill's lab has,
Who's Luke O'Neill? I wouldn't know who Luke O'Neill was.
Excuse me. So Luke's lab has made some great discoveries. My lab has made some reasonably good discoveries, and there are others that are around the place. But in the area of inflammation. So inflammation is a broad description of diseases that people think about inflammation, things like arthritis or multiple sclerosis. These are all sort of inflammatory diseases, but other diseases like cardiovascular diseases. So when you get cardiovascular disease, it has an immunological basis. So it's applying the knowledge we have, but dealing with more traditional immune-based diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, applying that to new discoveries for things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, cardiovascular, and cancer. Of course, cancer, it's been transformed, the treatment of cancer, thanks to immunology. So nearly all the new drugs for treating cancer come from immunology. And I predict that nearly all the new drugs that are going to come to treat neuroinflammatory, neurodegenerative disease are going to come from immunology. So immunology is going to be the basis of the new drugs to treat a vast array, not just the infectious diseases, but also the diseases that we didn't think were anything to do with the immune system, but do have a basis of inflammation in it. And that's where the really exciting discoveries are coming true, from finding ways of blocking the inflammation, new ways of doing it.
Okay. And then getting back to the more holistic, non-scientist part of you, in terms of, the endurance sport that you did, do you think humans are built for running marathons? Like, should we be putting that, you say yourself, you were put out by injury. I know you were knocked over by a car on the bike. That's different. But, I love exercise myself, but do you think our bodies are built for running marathons?
No, I don't think they were. Not on the concrete. If we could stick to running on the grass, the numbers of injuries would have been much, much less. And if we all had, when I was running, the development in shoes wasn't great, and I put down a lot of my injuries to bad footwear. So I think with modern shoes and keeping off the concrete, the injuries would be much less. But also overtraining. I overtrained. Nearly every sports person overtrains. So more days of rest and less training actually might have been the answer. Right. So I think if you look at rugby now, with the head injuries, I'm very worried. I'm a great rugby supporter. I'm a Leinster season ticket holder, and I love going and watching it. But I think they really have to wise up to the issues around head injuries and change the rules to try and reduce the impacts in the rucks in particular, for example. So I think that the sport is fantastic in terms of our health, and both physical and mental, but we do need to maybe look at what we're doing and not overdo it in terms of training and the actual activity in sporting events.
on the whole rugby issue, so this is a bone of contention with me, having 3 sons, one of whom loves it, and he already came home there with a black eye and a head injury there just recently. And I said, oh my goodness, this is the start of it. That does worry me. Do you think that the lobby groups are too loud for there actually to be what you've suggested, rules changed, a more safer environment? Because if you see schools rugby now, these are boys, but they're built like men. They're massive. It's not natural to see an 18-year-old or 17-year-old built the way they are now. And when they're running into each other, even just as 17, 18-year-olds, they can cause serious damage. So do you think it can change?
I think that the authorities they're playing a little bit of lip service to it right now. And I think they have to wise up to the risks associated with, 20 plus stone players charging into each other on a pitch and having head-to-head contact. You saw during the week, the various events that happened last weekend, the Heineken Cup, and the weekend before, and every weekend that I see it. I go to watch Leinster Rugby because I love watching the backs scoring tries.
Yeah.
And the ball running across the back of the pitch. I don't go there to watch rucks.
Yeah.
And pounding across the line trying to get tries. I want to see full-flowing, athletic players with the ball, and that's what entertainment. That's for as a spectator. That's what you want to see. I mean, maybe somebody wants to see head on head. I don't know.
Oh God,
I don't imagine there's very many that want to see that. But we could minimize it by changing the rules somewhat and making it more of a less of a contact game and more of a running game where. I don't profess to be an expert on rugby. I did play it for 6 years when I was in school, but the modern game is just so much more aggressive now in terms of the size of the players,
and they're just getting bigger and bigger. It's unbelievable. If you took schools rugby years ago and looked at them now, and as I said, I was at a recent match with my 14-year-old, and the 6-years are playing across the pitch, and they were like grown men, massive.
I think it has to start in the schools.
The
schools have to start, implementing policies that minimize head injuries and contact. And people have talked about, changing the tackling, to avoid contact around the head, and that's one positive thing that might come out of it, and changing the rules to make it a safer sport.
Yeah, I agree. Any tips for people out there on just healthy living in general?
I think exercise is, I know I was an exercise freak and I still am, but I think exercise is hugely beneficial for everybody, no matter what age you are. And even with disabilities, having exercise, whatever form or shape it can take, is really, really important. Because first of all, it mentally helps you, but physically, the benefits are absolutely huge in terms of what it can do for preventing diseases. And we've got a lot of issues with overweight people, and Ireland is not immune to that. We have maybe 25% of our population are obese, and the issues that brings with it are things like type 2 diabetes. If you get cancer, your chances of being able to deal with it immunologically are much, much reduced. There's a colleague of mine in Trinity, Lydia Lynch, who's looking at this, and she's got fantastic data showing the huge negatives of obesity on being able to deal with cancer. So there's a huge number of reasons why we should control our body weight, and exercise is one way of doing that, combined with proper food intake that's not excessive.
There probably needs to be a more of a national strategy, though, in terms of that kind of way of life, and encouraging exercise, and encouraging.
I think it
all
has
that
to start in the schools as well.
Yeah.
I would cut out all the vending machines. I would, and just try to encourage kids to bring
run around
healthy food to school, and to partake in PE rather than sitting in front of a computer all day.
Yes. Agreed. As a mother of 3 lads, throwing them out in hail, rain or snow outside. So it's been a pleasure chatting to you. At the end of my podcast, I always ask 2 questions. I did warn you. You're looking up. You're looking apprehensive. So I ask, in your opinion, what is the meaning of life, and what advice would you give to young people today?
I think on the advice to young people, in terms of their career progression, is to follow your. Sorry, I'll start again on that.
Yes, no
Okay.
problem.
So, in terms of advice for young people, follow your passion is my advice. So, when I was growing up and trying to decide what I would do for my career, I followed my passion. I didn't have anyone to advise me. And part of the problem with young people today, they get too much advice. And a lot of that is coming through social media, where they're being bombarded with information. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. That's where part of the problem that people are facing now. So I think if you're interested in something and it's not fashionable, pursue it, because it's inevitably going to be the thing that you're going to be successful at. So follow your passion is my advice in terms of a career. And it doesn't matter what the area is, and don't be led by what other people think about what you're doing and what you shouldn't do. In terms of the meaning of life, um, um, you know, people think about the meaning of life as the meaning of human life. But what sometimes it's important to think of is that life is more than human life. So life on Earth involves hundreds of thousands, millions of species. And unfortunately, there's one dominant species, and that's now man. And that dominant species has resulted in the extinction of hundreds of thousands of other species through the changes it's brought about to the Earth. So I'm quite worried about what we're doing to our planet, and a lot of it brought about by all of it brought about by humans, and we're destroying rainforests. We're consuming meat that if the land was used for growing crops only for vegetarian consumption would have a huge impact. We're not recycling the level we should. We're putting up concrete jungles everywhere, and Ireland used to be a forested country, and now we have what 3 or 4% covered in forestry. And you know, this is the lungs of the earth, and we're beginning to destroy it. So I think humans need to take a check on what they're doing to the earth, and we need to. I think the war in Ukraine has taught us a reliance on fossil fuels can't go on. And I think we have to look at what we're doing to the earth and change it.
So I don't really want to end the podcast now because I want to talk to you a little bit more in depth about that. Did you see just today that the article about the 15 countries that have agreed to, stop the climate, what we're doing to the climate and what we're doing to the planet, excluding the US, of course. Did you
I
read
didn't see
that?
that today. No.
So yeah, so this is all about COP15, etc. So yeah, it's a huge. I'm hugely interested in the whole environmental and climate change and all that. And where do you think we can start on just one human level, like me, my family, you, your family?
I think every family, and I mean, people think, well, if I don't recycle that, or if I don't sow a tree in my garden, or if I don't, you know, buy a diesel car, it won't make any difference. But it does. If everybody takes a small step, all those small steps will result in a benefit. So instead of taking the car and driving 3 miles to your place of work, walk or take the bus or cycle. And instead of buying packaged foods in the supermarket that were grown in South Africa or South America, buy Irish produce that's not packaged. And there's loads of small things we can all do to make the planet better. And I think we all need to start doing them. And we can also live healthier by exercising. I'm coming back to exercise
That's
again
okay.
because I'm
Yeah,
exercise freak,
yeah, of course.
but also just and eating in a way where we consume local products. And I think
But do you think that the local products idea? So I love that idea, but they tend to be more expensive than the flown in ones from
well,
Brazil.
this is part of the problem. That's why the
Yeah.
big, the chains of supermarkets like them. That's why they put them into packaging so they could keep the shelf life longer. But if you go into a French or a Spanish supermarket, you rarely see, for example, vegetables packaged in plastic with a styrofoam container underneath it. So I do think there are small measures that the supermarkets here could take on board. I mean, this is only the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
I mean, the bigger picture is that, renewable energies, and I'm not talking about growing crops that we're going to burn to make fuel. I'm talking about, genuine renewable. And I know that wind is one of solution, but it's not the only solution. There's wave power. There's other ways that we can all, individuals contribute by not buying diesel cars, by not buying petrol cars. And I know that electric cars are not the answer either, because the power has to come from somewhere to fuel those cars. So it's complex, but I think we all have a bit to play in it, and we can play a bit in it.
Mm. Yeah, no, I agree. And actually, one thing that I had forgotten to ask you, but now that we're still talking, I'm going to ask you: where do you see the whole university and third level education going? You, the likes of Elon Musk saying, we've everything at our fingertips now. We can literally go on Google. Like, should parents be encouraging their children to go to university to get this wider education? Is it going to change considerably now with the internet?
I think COVID, one of the things it taught us was that, interaction at a personal level is so important for development. And there are a couple of years of students and undergraduates and secondary school and primary school kids that missed out so much on their development because they didn't have that interaction during those 2 years of lockdowns. So that was direct evidence of the benefit of face-to-face teaching. So face-to-face teaching is here to stay, in my view. I don't believe a second that you can learn the same amount from online that you can from, in our area, especially, which is practical. We teach our students practical skills which can only be taught in a lab. It can't be taught online. You cannot do it online. You have to do it in a lab. But I also think the benefit, when I'm giving lectures, I constantly ask questions to the students and interact with them. So there's a dialogue all going. You can't do that on Zoom. So
You can't research on Zoom either.
you can't research on Zoom. So I genuinely think that there's no place for. There are places for online lectures, and there are huge benefits of having some lectures online. But there's also huge negatives of not having face-to-face contact with your lecturer. So I don't think this, it's going to come today or tomorrow where we're going to get rid of lecture theatres,
Mm.
and certainly not going to get rid of teaching labs or research labs, because that's where the real training for the scientists go on. And even in the arts, I would argue that the lecturing that goes on in lecture theatre is more beneficial for the student than what they would get from simply listening to it online.
Well, there is that whole interaction playing as well, and when someone puts up their hand versus someone on Zoom putting up their hand with no camera on, and like it is very different, because I do a little bit of public speaking, and the ones that I've done online have been, you don't know who you're talking to. Most people have their camera off. It's awful. You can't get because you feed off your audience or you feed off your students, yeah, and the energy they give you.
Absolutely. I mean, I've done during COVID, a lot of the conferences that I would normally attend, I would go to maybe 8 or 10 conferences a year, or I was before COVID. These were places I would get invited to speak, and you'd go and you give your lecture, and you meet the people afterwards, and meet them in the bar at night, and it's just a great way of interacting and getting what's going on in the world of science at first hand. But during COVID, I was giving lectures online through Zoom, and you'd be speaking into a camera, and you had absolutely no idea whether people were listening to you, finding it exciting, or interested. You didn't even know the numbers sometimes, because you
Yeah.
could look at the numbers, but you were never sure. I remember giving one lecture to the Korean Society of Immunology, and because Korea is on a completely different time zone to us, they decided they would tape it in advance, and then I would be there live to have the lectures and the questions after my lecture. And it was scheduled to happen at 6 o'clock in the morning. I set my alarm. I never heard my alarm. I jumped out of bed at about 6:15, rushed into the computer to find that my session was over. Some of the questions, so I'd missed the questions. But
Oh
but
no.
they'd heard my talk. But that's just epitomizes what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That the interaction that we had pre-COVID on at conferences and with lectures can't be replaced by just doing it online. So I don't agree that online is going to replace what we traditionally have done in person.
Hey, fair enough. Kingston, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Laura.